What's up guys, Survivor here, welcome back. It's time for some new VR benchmarks today, and this time we're gonna do frame rate and overall performance comparisons between the Nvidia RTX 2080 Ti, the GTX 1080 Ti and also my GTX 1070 laptop. For this purpose, I have handpicked 12 of the most popular VR first-person shooter games, which we're gonna run one by one and side by side with each GPU, followed by graphical charts for every game showing the average frame rates and percentages. I hope you're gonna enjoy this video, as it took me more than 4 days to finish, so please give it some love by leaving a thumbs up and comment with your thoughts. There's gonna be much more benchmark videos like this coming up, including casual VR games and also VR simulators using my new but still not unboxed i9-9900K processor from Intel, so subscribe today and stay tuned for much more interesting content here on Survivor. And before we begin, a huge thanks to all my lovely Patreon supporters and a special thanks to my 3 official sponsors on Patreon: Commander Darklight, Art Armin and VR Ambassador. Guys, I promised to get to the point faster this time, but before we jump into the benchmarks, let's talk about the PC hardware used in this test and also the resolutions and settings. The graphics cards used in this video are the MSI RTX 2080 Ti Gaming X Trio, the MSI 1080 Ti Gaming X, and a GTX 1070, which is a built-in GPU in my Asus ROG laptop. The RTX 2080 Ti is overclocked with plus 120 MHz, boosting around 2.1 GHz. The GTX 1080 Ti is overclocked with plus 90 MHz, boosting slightly above 2 GHz, while the laptop GTX 1070 GPU is at stock speeds to hold reasonable temperatures. Furthermore, all the 3 setups are using the latest Nvidia drivers version 416.94. The 2080 Ti and the 1080 Ti were tested in the same PC, which is my main PC VR rig, powered with an Intel i7-8700K processor clocked at 5 GHz and 32 GB of DDR4 RAM memory running at 3800 MHz with CAS latency 15. The laptop has an Intel i7-7700HQ processor at stock speeds and 16 GB of DDR4 RAM memory running at 2400 MHz. All the benchmarks are made by using the Pimax 5K Plus headset only, because I think the wide field of view, the high resolution and the maximum refresh rate of 90 Hz is optimal for such a benchmark to really push the limits and see the performance difference between the GPUs. Have in mind, the Pimax headsets are the most GPU demanding VR headsets on the market today, so if you are running the HTC Vive Pro or the Samsung Odyssey, you can expect much better frame rates and performance in all these VR games thanks to lower resolutions rendered. Oh, and how about the VR resolutions and the field of view used? All the benchmarks for all the 3 system configurations are based on the same resolution of 3200 x 2600, which is the default value of render quality 1.0 in the Python software. To maintain this resolution without super sampling or upsampling, I have put the SteamVR super sampling slider to 100% in manual override mode. The field of view option is set to normal in all tests, which gives us around 150 degrees of field of view horizontally. The parallel projection checkbox is only enabled for games that requires this option, which I will mention during these testings. Furthermore, all the in-game graphical options and settings are set identically for all the 3 graphic cards to make it fair, and I will show you the options chosen before each benchmark starts. And lastly, all of the games in these benchmarks are handpicked by me, and it's some of the most popular VR first-person shooters. And in new videos later on, I will do similar tests running VR simulators and other casual VR games, so stay tuned. Okay, enough with the talk, let's jump into it. First off, Zero Caliber. The overall quality in this game is set to high, while the anti-aliasing is turned off completely. I found this being a good balance for the performance while still looking great. The VR pixel density is on default, which is not shown as a number but should be 1.0. As you can already see, this is quite a demanding first-person shooter, and thankfully parallel projection was not required here, so this gives a minor performance boost after all. The RTX 2080 Ti is struggling already from the first mission, averaging averaging around 80 frames per second, sometimes even hitting full 90 frames per second. But the more enemies and action we see on the screen, the worse it gets, with frame rate dips even down to low 60s. The GTX 1080 Ti struggles even more and goes down to low 50s in frame rate during the more intense scenes, but the game is still fully playable, I would say. The GTX 1070 on the other hand shows completely with an average frame rate of around 30 and hitting low 20s during the action. Lowering the in-game overall quality option will help a lot here, but it makes the game quite ugly and boring, so I would not recommend that. The average frame rate difference is quite big here between the GPUs. The RTX 2080 Ti reaches almost 80 frames per second, the GTX 1080 Ti slightly above 60, and the 1070 struggling just above 30 frames per second. I would say a GTX 1080 Ti is a bare minimum for this game when running on a Pimax headset. The second first-person shooter is Gunheart, which also is a very GPU demanding game. In the game options, using mostly normal graphical settings without anti-aliasing, I turned down the shadows to low. Also the resolution is set to low, which gave me a good performance boost, and surprisingly enough, it looks identical to normal and still very sharp and beautiful on the Pimax headset. On the RTX 2080 Ti, the game runs very smooth, most of the time maxing out 90 frames per second, but in the most intense scenes with a lot of opponents, I saw dips even below 70 frames per second. Despite that, I would say the game is fully playable and I could hardly feel the frame drops while playing. The GTX 1080 Ti did quite okay here as well, averaging close to 80 frames per second and sometimes even hitting 90, but the heavy dips to mid-60s in frame rate during combat was more detectable and annoying here. On the GTX 1070 laptop, Gunheart runs quite bad but still playable, I would say. With an average frame rate of 40 frames per second, with intense actions staying above 30 frames per second, it runs at least better than Zero Caliber. Gunheart requires parallel projection to be enabled, and this might be the cause of the lower frame rate. All in all, I would say it's probably playable on a GTX 1080 or a GTX 1080 Ti, but to really enjoy this game, you will unfortunately need an RTX 2080 Ti. Next up, ATEX Cybernetics, another GPU-heavy first-person shooter, and while keeping the overall graphical quality on high, I had to disable all anti-aliasing. The game looks slightly more smooth with the TAA anti-aliasing on, but I would say it's more sharp without it, and it gives us a noticeable frame rate boost without having anti-aliasing on. Thankfully, this game does not need parallel projection to be enabled, but despite that, even the RTX 2080 Ti has some minor struggles here, hitting 90 frames per second only in occasional moments. The average frame rate though is not bad at all and stays on mid-80s with the 2080 Ti and around 70 frames per second on the 1080 Ti, making the game fully playable on both setups. The GTX 1070 laptop is struggling a lot here once again, but as frame rates are mostly hovering stable between 40 and 50 without any major dips, I would say it is fully playable, especially if you do teleporting instead of free locomotion, as you will not notice the frame rate loss that much if you teleport around. As for most of the games in this benchmark video, the GPU utilization is rather low despite frame rates below 90, so I think some more optimizations in the title rendering or Steam VR is necessary here. Wardust is quite a new VR first-person shooter made by the Raptor Lab, the developers of the successful Battle Royale game Standout. For this game, I kept the graphical quality on Beautiful, which is the second highest option, and the MSAA anti-aliasing is kept disabled as I don't think the game needs it on the Pimax. Both the RTX 2080 Ti and the GTX 1080 Ti can handle Wardust with smooth 90 frames per second almost constantly, but the 1080 Ti had very minor dips down to mid-80s. I also saw some bigger dips to around mid-50s, and I'm not sure if it really is the game causing it or the recording itself, so I will blame it on my PC this time. The GTX 1070 laptop runs the game surprisingly good with an average frame rate of almost 85. The frame rate was quite unstable though, jumping all over the place all the way from 90 down to mid-60s, but I have to admit I never saw this as a problem while playing. Most of the time it still felt rather smooth and fully playable, and while the smoothness was more stable on the 1080 Ti and the 2080 Ti of course, I would say the overall experience and playability in Wardust was almost the same running on my GTX 1070 laptop, and that's actually great news. Now let's try Robo Recall, an Oculus home game that I'm running through Steam VR with Revive for this test. I kept graphics quality on high, while the anti-aliasing is set to value 2, because without anti-aliasing the game looks just too jaggy. I also kept the adaptive resolution option that automatically adjusts between 0.7 and 1.0, which helps a lot with the performance. The RTX 2080 Ti gives us a fairly good average frame rate, mostly between 80 and 90, but in intense scenes with lots of action and effects, the frame rate dips are noticeable, going down even below 70, but I must say I never saw it as a problem while playing. Robo Recall runs quite acceptable on the 1080 Ti as well, and the average frame rate stays mostly around 70 while in action. It may sound slow, but I wouldn't call it a problem, especially if you're using teleportation. You won't get bothered about the frame rate and reprojection on your hands and weapons. For the GTX 1070, Robo Recall is a no-go with Pimax. The frame rate is hovering around 40 frames per second, and while it's mostly stable, the more intense moments are really becoming hard to handle because of all reprojection. During the slow motion attacks, all the light effects really chokes the GTX 1070 with frame rates in low 30s, and while it might be a good idea to turn off the planar reflections or indirect shadows in the game options, I'm not sure how much it will really help here, as I totally forgot to try it and I apologize for that. Moving on, Doom VFR. If you have seen my previous videos, you probably know this game needs the TSS-AA x8 anti-aliasing to be enabled to really look good and acceptable on the Pimax, no matter what resolution used. Also, I kept most settings on Ultra except shadows quality on Medium, so there's a lot of headroom to tweak settings here. Luckily, Doom VFR runs pretty great on both the RTX 2080 Ti and the GTX 1080 Ti with average frame rates of 90 or very close to 90. There are some intense scenes which can make even the RTX GPUs to dip down to low 80s, but it doesn't happen often, and mostly you will get a smooth frame rate throughout the game. On the GTX 1070, the game still runs pretty fine, averaging around 70 frames per second, and while I never really reached 90 frames per second, I must say the game feels surprisingly smooth and fully playable even on a laptop. Doom VFR has quite good GPU utilization, sometimes around 90%, which is quite unusual for VR games with Pimax and high resolutions, and that makes the frame rate quite stable without any big jumps or dips. All in all, Doom VFR runs great on all the three setups and GPUs, and GTX 1070 owners should have no problem reaching 80 or 90 frames per second on a Pimax 5K Plus if some of the in-game graphical settings are tweaked down. Now, Pavlov VR. For this benchmark, I've kept everything on maximum in the in-game settings, including the scaling, except for anti-aliasing, which I turned down to high instead of ultra. Pavlov requires the parallel projection option to be enabled in Python, which lowers the overall performance a bit, but I must say the 2080 Ti and 1080 Ti does a great job here. The RTX GPU almost never dips below the stable 90 frames per second, and while the 1080 Ti gets some occasional dips to mid-80s, you will most likely never notice it while playing. You can of course lower the in-game scaling a bit or just lower the anti-aliasing to low and get rid of the occasional frame rate dips, but I wouldn't say it's even necessary. As for the GTX 1070 laptop, it runs fine and it is playable, but the frame rate with these settings averages around 60 frames per second, which is not optimal, especially in a fast and competitive online first-person shooter. If you turn down the scaling to an acceptable level and lower some of the in-game settings, you will end up with average frame rates of around 75 or even 80, but that also takes away some of the important in-game sharpness. I would personally recommend something in between the 1080 Ti and the 1070 to really enjoy Pavlov in VR, preferably a desktop GTX 1080. Next up, Onward, a game that does not use parallel projection and also has great performance overall. In this test, I actually maxed out all the in-game settings, including the shadow resolution and distance, which of course is not necessary, but I think it will give you a better idea of how the GPUs performs against each other. Both the 2080 Ti and the 1080 Ti runs fully smooth here, with only some occasional dips where the 1080 Ti can go down to 80 frames per second or slightly lower. Those dips are very short though and will not affect the gameplay, I would say. While the GTX 1070 laptop struggles a bit more here, we need to admit it's not performing bad at all. With an average frame rate of around 80 frames per second with the GTX 1070 using maxed out in-game settings, Onward is fully playable on the laptop, and of course there is loads of headroom for tweaking the settings, especially the shadow resolution that can be set lower and give a huge boost and make it fully smooth on a GTX 1070 laptop. A competitive online first-person shooter really needs a smooth frame rate to be acceptable, and in terms of performance, Onward is probably one of the best choices here. Now let's try raw data. Using maximum, or epic as it's called, settings on everything except anti-aliasing being set to low, the game runs like a dream on the RTX 2080 Ti with mostly butter smooth 90 frames per second, despite the fact that raw data requires parallel projection to be enabled. The only dips I've seen is 1 or 2 frames per second during the most intense scenes, but it's really not noticeable. Using the RTX, I could probably have anti-aliasing maxed out as well, but I'm not really sure if that's needed, as the game really looks great with AA on low. The 1080 Ti falls not far behind in terms of performance, getting an average frame rate of around 85 frames per second with only some occasional dips below 80. But I've never seen the frame rate go below 75 frames per second even while having a whole bunch of opponents, explosions and effects in front of me. The GTX 1070 laptop struggles though, but still it is playable, and have in mind we're running this game with almost maxed out settings, so you can lower down some of the options to reach a more acceptable frame rate average, and I have no doubts you can make it fully playable on a GTX 1070. It may never reach smooth 90 frames per second on a GTX 1070, but I would say it's not needed, especially if you prefer to play raw data with teleportation instead of free locomotion. Let's try Wanted Killer, a really cool looking Unity engine game that unfortunately is quite GPU demanding as well, despite not using parallel projection option. The game has no graphical options as far as I can see, and while it looks great and runs mostly smooth on the RTX 2080 Ti, as soon as the scenes gets more intense, the frame drops to mid-80s or low 80s starts. On the GTX 1080 Ti, the frame drops are more apparent, and here we can also see some dips down to mid or low 70s. The average frame rates are still good though, not far from 85 frames per second, and the minor frame loss does not really affect the gameplay at all. With the GTX 1070, Wanted Killer starts to suffer, and in the skyscraper mission we never see frame rates above 50 frames per second. While the average frame rate is around 45 and it's quite low, the frame rates are still very stable around that number without major differences. So if you are used to play with a lot of reprojection and can handle a game maybe using teleportation instead of free locomotion, you will most likely enjoy Wanted Killer on a GTX 1070 anyway. So we have 2 more games to go, and the next one is Stand Out. The game is built on the same engine as Wardust, and we're using the same in-game options here, graphical quality on beautiful and no MSAA anti-aliasing used. Stand Out does not require parallel projection, and it runs really smooth on both the desktop GPUs. While the GTX 1080 Ti could see some very minor frame rate dips on very open landscapes with a lot of details, you will most likely never see those frame dips on the 2080 Ti. The RTX GPU has much better frame times overall, and I could barely see the FPS go below 90 at all during long gameplay sessions. The GTX 1070 struggles to maintain the smooth frame rate here, but at least it's quite stable around 60 or 65 most of the time, which makes the game fully playable without being frustrating. Have in mind I'm using a GTX 1070 laptop for this test, so if you have a desktop GTX 1070 also overclocked to the max, I'm sure you can squeeze out an average frame rate of maybe 75 or even 80 frames per second in Stand Out. So the last game I'm benchmarking today is Alpha Mike Foxtrot, or AMF. The game does not need parallel projections to be enabled, and I could not find any in-game graphical settings. Alpha Mic Foxtrot runs silky smooth on the Pimax with both the RTX 2080 Ti as well as the GTX 1080 Ti, staying on 90 frames per second almost the entire time I was testing it without any bigger frame dips at all. The frame rate may vary between the maps of course, just like in most other games such as Onward and Pavlov for example, but I would say if you have a GTX 1080 Ti or higher, you have a lot of headroom to play with in terms of performance. Looking at the GTX 1070 laptop, we see it struggle with frame rates hovering mostly around 60 frames per second. I'm not sure what's causing the bottleneck here, as both the GPU and the CPU frame times are quite high. All in all, Alpha Mic Foxtrot is fully playable on all three setups and GPUs, even if I much prefer the butter smooth frame rate using my desktop GTX 1080 Ti and the RTX 2080 Ti, especially if you're going to play online and need the more high precision while aiming without any reprojection. So guys, that was it for this time. Big thanks for watching, and please let me know what you think about these results in this VR benchmark video. Is the RTX 2080 Ti worth to buy for VR gaming? Is the 1080 Ti more than enough for first-person shooters in VR? And is a laptop with a GTX 1070 really enough to play VR games with a Pimax high resolution and wide field of view headset? Or do you have any questions regarding my benchmarks? Please leave your comments here below and stay tuned for more VR benchmarks coming up in VR games and also in VR simulators of course. I will soon let you know the performance difference running VR simulators with an Intel i7 8700K versus my new i9 9900K, and of course many other benchmarks as well. So get subscribed now if you still haven't, and hit that bell button to get notifications on my new videos. Again, a big thanks to all my Patreon supporters, and a special thanks to my official sponsors on Patreon, Commander Darklight, Art Armin and VR Ambassador. Enjoy your weekend now guys, and see you soon again. Cheers!